We've all been there. You walk into a class, unveil your lesson plan with all the joy and care of a museum curator lifting the veil on a new Van Gogh, and your students just don't care. They've got their own problems, their own stresses. Maybe they decided in 4th grade that they didn't like reading, in 5th grade that they weren't creative, in 7th grade that they needed to give serious attention to social media if they wanted to stay cool. And now they're sitting in your class, eyes not so subtly glued to the little glowing screen under their desk or the clock above your MLA poster display. So, what do you do? In today's podcast, I want to share 5 different paths you might take to help them tap back into ELA. Choose your favorite, connect the dots on 2 or 3, or try them all. Ready? Welcome to the Spark Creativity Teacher Podcast, a podcast for English teachers looking for more creativity, more engagement, more joy, and no more scripted curriculum, lesson planning ruts, or boring book lists. I'm Betsy Potash, and I'm honored you're trusting me to help. You're not alone on this creative journey anymore. Okay, so the first pathway for today is to focus on connection. One way to chip away at apathy is to really put your energy on connecting with your students on a personal level. And this could come in so many different forms. I had a mentor teacher who always came up with fun nicknames for her students. So she just had a million nicknames up her sleeve, and she would create one for every student, and it would just become like this special bond for them. Another way to do this is to go to some sports games or theater performances or debates at your school, just to have something on the side that you can talk about with your students. So maybe you have a whole bunch of basketball players in one of your blocks, and that class for some reason just isn't engaging much. Maybe you show up at a couple games and you start talking with them about basketball, and you show them that you care in this other way, and that can help you connect. Another option would be to work up some email templates for positive notes home, and just really for a few weeks put your attention towards sending tons of positive notes home. That's another way to connect with kids. Maybe you roll out a bunch of surveys in your class. What are your students' interests? What kind of books and projects and activities did they like in the past? What's their favorite food? What's their favorite soda? What's their favorite band right now? Just like whatever you can find to connect on with them can be really helpful. When you focus on connection, you help students start to feel more at home in your class and more interested in paying attention. And it's not necessarily about the content yet. There's probably no problem with your content to begin with, but you just need to get them to care enough to notice that your content is interesting and important and relevant and fun. Because if they're already turned off before they ever meet you, it's just not necessarily about what you're teaching. So this focusing on connection can help. The relationships that you have with those kids can help them overcome their apathy. And often you want to use like some of the other strategies that we're talking about today too, in conjunction with focusing on connection. But it can be a really helpful way to start. If you're just looking for a super simple way to get started, one of my favorite, easiest ways to get started with relationship building is attendance questions. And I have certainly talked about them here before, but it's such a simple thing. You just throw up a slide that says like, do you love mountains or beaches better? And you just ask every kid. And it's like this simple, small point of connection at the beginning of class, but it can be a great community builder. You can sometimes follow it up with a student if they ask, or if they answer with like a surprising answer, you can talk to them about it later. And it's just like an easy starting point. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to some of my own favorite free, fun attendance questions if you'd like to get started with that. Okay. Second pathway, let's talk about incorporating your students' interests into their work. Now, this is something that I was really reminded of last year when I interviewed CJ Reynolds. I don't know if you remember the episode, but we were talking about classroom management strategies you can actually enjoy. And he told a personal story about his experience in high school where he was learning about the hero's journey and he was learning about, all those different points on the hero's journey, and he just found it so boring. But at the same time, he was really into the kind of movies that feature the hero's journey. And he was just reminiscing and saying, if anybody had explained it to him in terms of those movies, he would have enjoyed the process and been so much more interested in it at the time. And so in his class, he used that lesson that he learned as a kid to try to help his kids. So he talked about how he would watch TV shows he didn't even like sometimes, or a movie that he knew that all of his students were going to that weekend, or try to pick up some manga if his students were really into manga, so that he could build the kind of content that they loved into his assignments, his writing prompts, his speaking prompts, chat with kids about it in between lessons, that kind of thing. And I really think this is a very valuable strategy and a strategy worth trying. So you've got some kids who are feeling super apathetic maybe about writing arguments, but you get to talking with them about the one chip challenge and they are so passionate about it. Maybe you frame your whole argument unit around chips, different types of chips. What are the best chips? Is it right that they banned the one chip challenge? Is it okay to have knockoffs of the one chip challenge? Whatever, right? You can still teach the skills that you want to teach and base it around this super hot topic that kids are really excited to debate and really want to argue about. Another example of this would be you're moving into poetry, you want to teach poetic devices, you want to talk about tone and mood. Maybe you do that through Taylor Swift songs. We had an episode a few weeks ago on the podcast, the Taylor Swift collab-isode, with all the fun ideas for teaching through Taylor Swift. This is another easy way to bring the content that students are passionate about together with the skills you want them to learn. You can do this in so many different ways. I'm sure you have a million ideas. Maybe your students are obsessed with TikTok, and maybe you can bring in some crazy TikTok trend into your rhetorical analysis unit. Whatever. Incorporating your students' interests anywhere, everywhere you can will help you build relationships with them, that first thing we talked about. And it can also help you reel them a little closer to those ELA skills. It's a fun challenge. It's interesting. Of course, it means you have to kind of rewrite your activities on the fly as you move through the year and as you learn more about your students and what they care about. But you don't have to do it for every single lesson. Just bringing in a little more of this is a fantastic step. Okay, third pathway, I want to talk about choice reading, because for me, this was such an important vehicle toward better relationships and better motivation for my students. When I was in the classroom, I was very big into creative activities and projects and choice reading and so many things, as you know, but it wasn't necessarily my greatest strength to be super chatty with my students between periods. I was not the teacher who was out in the hall cracking jokes and coming up with all those nicknames like my mentor teacher, giving everybody a high five. I'm more introverted than that. But once I started really getting seriously into choice reading, I found that it helped me get to know my students better and help them be more motivated across the board, because the reading itself would become a subject of conversation for us. And that was really easy for me. That was my wheelhouse. I love talking to them about books. That's, one of the reasons I wanted to be an English teacher. So it was easier for me to engage them about books than it was to engage them about the hot chip challenge or whatever. I especially remember this one student I had, Torin, when I was teaching in Bulgaria. And for the first bit of our class, it seemed like he was just sort of looking down on the class from some higher plane. He would smile ironically at all my attempts to engage him. He'd just stay out of every activity and discussion as much as he could. He was obviously really smart, but it seemed like he could care less about the class. And then I rolled out choice reading, and I started watching what he was reading, and he was obsessed with super dense history books. He would be sitting there with a 900-page book about the history of some European country, and he would just be glued to it during all of choice reading. And it gave us this major point of connection. I could ask him about these history books. I could suggest other books with historical topics. And all of a sudden he would like smile back at me, instead of just sort of coping with having to be in my class. And it made such a big difference. He understood that I cared about his interest in history. He warmed up to me, he warmed up to the class. And then a few months later, when we had our poetry slam, he was one of the class slam winners. His poem was amazing. He got like huge applause. I still just remember it with so much delight. And that's just one kid's story, but it really, for me, it crystallizes what choice reading can do in terms of connection. Because when kids see that you care about what they actually want to read and like to read, and you're trying to help them with that, it builds a connection, it builds a relationship, and then it brings them, again, a huge step toward the rest of your ELA class. Because if they're building their reading and vocabulary and comprehension and their stamina for sitting with a book, it's just going to make everything else easier. Number 4, choose projects with a hook. And let me explain what I mean by a hook. If you've been around here for long, you know that I think projects can be a very powerful motivation for learning the skills in almost any unit. I've always liked to use the name showcase projects. With a showcase project, students are eventually going to be sharing something amazing that they create. And they're going to be working on that amazing something all through the unit. And so in order to produce said amazing thing, they're going to need the skills that you're going to be teaching in the unit. And somehow that just makes everything so much more engaging and feel so much more necessary to them when they know, okay, gosh, I'm going to show my documentary film to my classmates in 3 weeks. So I guess I really do need to learn what B-roll is. I really do need to learn how to reach out to somebody for an interview, how to videotape the interview, how to come up with good interview questions. I really do need to learn about film angles and mixing in sound and overlaying captions, because if I don't, my documentary film in my class's festival is going to be terrible. And I'm not going to have a chance to be, one of the 3 finalists who go on to the school-wide festival that we invite the parents to. And you see what I mean? Like that fact of the film festival that looms, hopefully happily, in a few weeks at the end of the unit is what provides the drive and interest along the way. And I find that can be a really great way to overcome that sense that like, oh, English, I'm not really an English person. Like, okay, maybe you don't see yourself as an English person or a creative person, but do you like YouTube? Like, are you interested in creating videos? Are you, would you like to do well in our film festival? Like, let's try learning these skills. And then it's much more interesting than just like, today we're talking about, what theoretically makes a good interview, and we're going to practice writing interview questions. But it doesn't lead into like this idea of this showcase project where you have an authentic audience. So there are a million ways to do that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a documentary film festival. That's been something I've been working on a lot lately and have found really interesting. But I've had great success with it with poetry by integrating some kind of performance piece in a poetry unit. Usually for me, it's been a poetry slam. I've had success with it with theater units where students are going to do a performance at the end of the unit. Maybe you wrap up a nonfiction unit with a podcast project, or a novel unit with a food truck festival. There are all different ways to create that hook through a project that helps give fire to a unit. Okay, last but not least, this pathway I think is super important. Even if your students, love English and aren't apathetic at all and do care, I still think this is a really important thing to think about. And that is to try really varying your text throughout the year. Back when I was a student, we read novel after novel after novel after novel. And there's nothing wrong with a good novel. I love a good novel. But to help engage every kid, and especially to help kids who might be feeling a little medium about novels, there are so many other options, right? We could have a novel in verse. We could have book clubs around some genre that students might get excited about. Maybe it's like memoirs with different figures that are still alive, contemporary figures that they find fascinating, like Michelle Obama or Trevor Noah. Or maybe you want to try graphic novels as a new way to engage your students. I think these are an amazing option. If you find that your students really are not feeling engaged with the classics, swapping in some of Gareth Hines' versions of classics, like the graphic novel of the Odyssey, the graphic novel of Romeo and Juliet, those could be wonderful options. And then once you have students hooked and you have them interested in the book, you can start to bring in some of the traditional text too to help them see the differences and analyze, what's working better in the traditional text, what's working better in the graphic novel. And that can just be, again, like this hook that helps them see, okay, this is actually a pretty interesting story. And then once they're already there, you can bring in more of the traditional text and more of the analysis. More types of units you can bring in. You can do a podcast unit. You can do short documentaries. You can do short films. You can do long films. There are so many ways to teach ELA skills with a range of texts, and there are so many free online multimedia options. It's amazing. And so I think this is really important. If you're finding that your students are not falling in love with the long novel and it's just feeling like they don't care, and it's like you're wading through this long unit and you just want to get out, try changing it up with some shorter units with some different types of text. You can get through a novel in verse or a graphic novel or a podcast unit in maybe 2 weeks instead of 8 weeks. And you can give your students just a chance to really engage, have some success before you turn around and try something else. And all those little footholds along the way, they make a difference. Okay, so we've talked about 5 different pathways. We've talked about how important it can be to focus on connection, just building that personal relationship with students in whatever way works for you with your personality and your strengths. We talked about incorporating your students' interests into your work. This can be just a fun, small shift as you're creating writing prompts and speaking prompts. Think about what students are really excited about right now. We talked about writing your choice reading program to better motivation. This one has been huge in my own teaching. I hope it will be for you too. We talked about choosing projects with a hook, a project that helps give legs to your unit because kids want the skills so they can succeed on the project. And then finally, we talked about different types of text, how you could change it up from a lot of novels to maybe incorporate more novels in verse, graphic novels, shorter book clubs, podcasts, documentary films, longer films, this type of thing. So, however you want to mix and match these, remember, you don't have to do it all at once. Maybe this week you try some attendance questions. You start this idea of working on relationships a little bit. Maybe in another week or two, you integrate some content that's really based on your students' interests and you see how they respond. Maybe you get a few new books for your choice reading program over winter break and start previewing a couple of graphic novels just in case. You do it however you want, but whatever you can fit, whenever you can fit it, I think it can make a difference. It can help you chip away at the apathy, help you see more engagement, more students caring, more classes that feel like they have momentum instead of feeling like they're a struggle. I'll be cheering for you. Thanks so much for joining me today to talk about how to deal with it when you feel like your students just don't care. Until next time, take care of yourself and stay creative.